light that's been filtered by whatever's happening in the projector to take on a particular form. But the form is just sculpted light. That's all it basically is just sculpted light, which we see on the screen. And that light has the potential, that white light has the potential to become any image that you could think of, any movie you could possibly conceive of, made or unmade. That light could become anything. But we forget that. We just, unless we sometimes turn around and look at the projector and then you see where the light's coming from. But most of the time we watch the screen and get lost in the images. The same, I think, is happening in consciousness. We have this ability for experience. And then that takes form. Various perceptions, whatever it is, feelings, thoughts, are the forms which arise in consciousness. And probably the forms correspond to what determines the forms is what goes on in the brain. So the brain would correspond to the film in the projector. But that doesn't mean to say the brain produces the consciousness. It may determine the shapes, the forms, the experiences that arise in consciousness. But to say the brain produces consciousness is a bit like saying the projector produces the light which shines through the film, or rather the film produces the light, whereas it's actually in the projector. And again, the same is true of consciousness in terms of its potential. You could say our consciousness has the potential to become every experience we ever have, or could ever have, or that any being could ever have, whether it's a human being or an extraterrestrial or a dog, whatever. Every single experience that could ever be had is in consciousness as a potential. And I'd just like to make one thing clear distinction of what I mean by mind, because we use it in different ways, again, in our culture. Mind, in which I will be using it, I call it mind with a big M, capital M, are all the things like, it's everything that happens in consciousness, our perceptions, our memory, our sensations, imagination, intuitions, feelings. These are all forms, appearances that arise in the mind. And then there's mind with a small m, which is things like our thinking, our reason, which we often talk about mind. We talk about mind as opposed to feeling, mind as opposed to heart. We're talking about mind with a small m. But for me, heart, feeling, emotion, that's all part of the big mind, that realm of overall experience. And the question that comes, and this is the big thorny question for science, is why is there mind? Why does all this neurological processing that goes on, why is there awareness with it? Why doesn't it all just go on in the dark? This is I could say the $64,000 question. It's probably the $64 billion question. And this is the paradox. We all know we're conscious, and there's no way to explain it in science. It's easier to explain probably how the universe evolved from the Big Bang or whatever it was that set it off, all the way through to the present day. That's easier to explain than why any of us ever has a single thought in our mind. Science prides itself on its predictive abilities. If you come up with a new theory in science, you always test it by seeing if it predicts the state of affairs correctly. But the one thing it doesn't predict is that any of us should ever have a single experience. This is what is currently called today the hard problem in science. Why are we conscious? Why do we have experience? Not so much how the brain affects consciousness. This has sometimes been called the easy problem of consciousness. David Chalmers, who was professor of philosophy at Arizona, he's actually just moved back to Australia, he said, the easy problems of consciousness are understanding what goes on in the brain when you have maybe a certain feeling or solve a certain mathematical problem, have a certain thought. We may one day understand that, which is like understanding what the film is like in the projector. We may one day understand what goes on in the brain when we have a certain experience. Those are the easy problems, relatively easy. Very hard problems, actually. We said the real hard problem is why any of that gives rise to experience. The way he put it was, how does something as immaterial as consciousness ever arise from something as unconscious as matter? We assume that matter is unconscious, and therefore our brain cells are unconscious, and all the chemical, electrical activity that goes on is unconscious. How the hell does consciousness come out of it? That's what's often called the hard problem of consciousness. I actually don't think it's a hard problem at all. I think it's an impossible problem. It's actually we're asking the wrong question. And the reason is we're stuck in the wrong paradigm. And just very briefly, just to recap on paradigms, paradigm is a word that's often, it's got misused a lot in recent times. You know, we talk about paradigms in diets and goodness knows what. The original idea of paradigm was put forward by Thomas Kuhn as the basic idea that underlies any area of science. So quantum theory is a paradigm in physics. So is relativity theory a paradigm. You could say the DNA model is a paradigm in molecular biology. It's a sort of the deep, unquestioned assumptions that we think are true. We think are absolutely true, and that science does all its work in. And what Kuhn showed was we think they're true, but they change with time. And when they change, there's a big resistance. Scientists don't like changing their minds. You know, we'll change jobs, we'll change partners, we change where we live, but changing our minds, that's much, much harder. And so when this happens, when a new paradigm comes in, there's a huge struggle that goes on. And the classic case, which I just want to go over briefly because it's relevant to consciousness, is what happened 500 years ago with the Copernican revolution. And before that, the old worldview was the Earth was the center of the universe, and everything went round the Earth, and in perfect circles, because Plato said there's the Earth and there's the heavens. The heavens are perfect. Perfect motion is circular motion. Therefore, everything in the heavens has to move on a circle, which was true of all the stars, but the sun, moon, and the 5 visible planets didn't move in perfect circles. And so there was this question of why they were moving against the stars. And what the medieval astronomers did was come up with these ideas, sticking to circles. They had, well, maybe there were circles rolling around circles. And if you had a circle rolling around a circle carrying a planet, then sometimes it would go faster when it was at the top of the circle, and then it would go slow at the bottom, even go backwards. And they started playing with these things called epicycles. And that got a bit better, but it wasn't quite accurate enough, so they put more circles rolling around the circles, rolling around the circles, and they started shifting the axes around, and they started getting things like this to try and explain it. And it got more and more cumbersome until along came Copernicus, who said 2 things. The first he said was the Earth spins, which everybody thought was absolutely stupid, because it's absolutely obvious that the Earth is still, right? I mean, nothing's flying around this room. They argued, they said, quite logically at the time, if the Earth is spinning, all the oceans would slop up on one side. A bowl of water would all slop up on one side. It doesn't, it's flat. Therefore, the Earth is not moving. Don't be stupid. The second thing he said, which would have got him into a lot of trouble, except he didn't really say it till just before he died. He was a churchman. He was actually quite cautious about the Vatican. He said the Earth is a planet orbiting the sun, and everybody thought that was not just stupid, it was heretical. And then we know the story. Along came Galileo about 60 years later and looked through his telescope and found evidence for it, and the bishop said, don't be silly, we're not even going to look down your telescope. And then the other thing that happened exactly at the same time was Kepler. He was looking at the actual orbits, and he realized the orbits weren't circles. It all made sense if the orbits were ellipses. He had no idea why they were ellipses rather than circles, but he broke the thing with Plato. Copernicus still stuck to Plato's idea of circles. And then it was actually later still, another 40 years after that, Sir Isaac Newton came along and actually showed that the laws of heaven and the laws of earth were the same, and when he did that, he realized that all orbits were ellipses and the whole thing made sense. But it took nearly 150 years for that revolution to happen.